Okay, thanks for joining. Small crowd today. Everyone's just kind of getting back into it. Early January, or actually it's mid-January already. So Happy New Year to everybody. Good to see everybody. My name is Jay Malone. I'm the founder of New Haircut. New Haircut's a product strategy group that we like to use design thinking to support product and UX leaders who are excited to develop customer-centered products, bring them to market quickly, build lots of alignment and clarity on the experiences that they're creating. Welcome to the Problem Framing AMA. This is our 11th Problem Framing AMA. We also host a couple others that are down here. So if you have access to the board, I'll drop the link in there one more time in the chat. We host these bi-weekly. They're free. They're a great opportunity to learn. I get to learn a whole bunch. Hopefully you do as well. We also host design sprint AMAs and facilitation AMAs, which is a new one that we're doing. We're here for 27 more minutes, so I'm going to get straight into answering some questions. Down at the bottom, if you have to jump early, down at the bottom, there's some additional resources down here. One is our toolkit, if you're excited to try to take some of these practices forward and facilitate your own problem framing workshops. There's also this free facilitation mini course. There's a video series where I interview other product and UX leaders about facilitation, design thinking, and innovation. And then finally, there's some contact information for me if you'd like to connect on LinkedIn or shoot me an email. So without further ado, what I did is what I use this mural board. If this is the first time you're coming to one of our AMAs, this board will stay open and active. So if you have the link once, you have it forever. And what I do is I use it to capture past questions as well as questions that you'd like to hear answers to today. So if you haven't added your question, you can drop it in here. And if you see another question, so the way it works is stuff that I've answered is over here. Those are from past episodes. And the little pink Post-its will take you to the answer for that question. And then in the middle are unanswered questions. So things that we got to get to today and maybe in future AMAs. If you see one that you like, drop a little smiley next to it so I know that you're interested in it. And what I'm going to do is I'll prioritize any that have smileys next to them. Transparently, I'm going to answer some questions that I answered in the last AMA, which was in December, because I forgot to record it. So I'm going to go through some of those again because they were interesting questions, and then I'll get to the next ones in the next AMA, which is posted right over here to the right. So if we don't get to your questions or the ones that you wanted to hear about, join me on the next one, which is Monday, February 21st. And okay, let's get to it. So I found a whole bunch of questions down here, or 4 questions that had smileys next to them. So I'm gonna work through those. And as I was going through them earlier this morning, I added some pink Post-its to give me some ideas on things that I want to answer. So I'm going to kind of work clockwise here. Okay. First question was, how do you get someone to agree? How do you get someone or a team to agree they need a problem framing workshop? It's a little bit out on the fringe. There's not a lot of documentation or resources that talk about problem framing. So sometimes it's a foreign topic. So I get the question. What I do to help groups understand the need and the value behind it, a couple things. One is I host, before I would do any kind of workshop, especially one, problem framing takes a couple half days, so it's a decent investment of time. Before I do anything that requires that much time, I'm interviewing and talking with key stakeholders, getting a sense of what's important to them. And it's at that point that I can understand what they've done in this space. So for example, a lot of groups will reach out and say, hey, we want to hire you to facilitate a design sprint. And I would ask them things about what's the problem that they're trying to solve? What have they done in that space? Do they have a product that they've already launched to market? And what that helps me understand is the amount of research and understanding and questions that they've asked of their market. And so if they talk a lot about business related metrics, so we want to improve engagement, we want to improve the onboarding experience, what I'm trying to hear them articulate is the customer problem. So if they can't articulate that, then that for me is a flag that they need to spend a little bit of time making sure that there is a customer-centered problem and that they all agree upon it. So I use those preliminary conversations to listen in and understand what they know about this space, especially if it's a new space that they're moving into. Then the need for framing and discovery and research is probably even greater. So those are a great indicator. That's beforehand. Once I'm with a team, whether in the workshop or doing some discovery work, what I might ask them to do, I've shared this in other tips before. This is a 30-minute activity where you could ask a group of people to individually write down the problem that we're working through. So again, using a design sprint as just a good analogy here. If I ask the group, hey, Peter, Josh, Teddy, what problem are we using this design sprint to solve? And you'd work on that individually. And if everybody came back with different ideas, different customer segments, in general, just misalignment, that's another good indicator that we should spend time making sure that we are aligned and that we have articulated and sort of found a problem that's worth solving and that we're all on the same page. Because disagreeing about a problem is okay, but if we're all there to solve different problems or a problem for different customer segments or expecting very different outcomes, then that can cause a lot of trouble. Framing is a critical component of framing is to reach some kind of alignment and buy-in. So if we're all starting off in very different problem spaces, then that's another indicator that we should start with framing. Always a good question. Okay, clockwise. This question. Any problems, pitfalls, or things to watch out for in problem framing? This is from, I know, Kristine. Yeah, sure. There's a lot. So number one, take this one first. So one is problem framing is not about solutioning. Problem framing is about understanding the problem and the questions behind it. And so most people are excited to get into the solution. And so when I talk about problems, when I talk about we're going to ask questions, we're going to slow down, that causes people are impatient in general. They want to get into the solution, or they already think they know what the solution is. And so they have a tendency to jump into that mode. So one pitfall is that you allow the team to jump into solutioning before everyone in the room really understands the problem. As much as you think you understand the problem, there could be one or two or a few other people that aren't clear. And if you just kind of trudge forward, then that can cause folks to feel sort of disconnected and feel like maybe their ideas weren't part of the conversation early on. So solutioning, trying to avoid solutioning is tricky. Bias is another one. So many groups will assume they know what the problem is, or it'll be very internally focused. So they think if we can fix onboarding and make that experience better, then our customers will just be happier. But maybe the customer really doesn't have a problem with coming into your platform or your product. So biasing, bringing your own assumptions about what's important, that the problem is understood by the entire team, right? Again, kind of like jumping into being very assumptive about that. So bias tends to creep into problem framing conversations. Another one that I thought about was the appetite for complexity. So whenever I ask a group, what would be a successful outcome from going through a sprint or going through these series of innovation workshops, and they'll talk about moonshots, they'll talk about big, bold, exciting new ideas. And with that comes a series of challenges, right? To solve a really complex challenge and come up with to solve a new problem with a new set of solutions is complex. And if not, then it would be something that's simpler and everyone would probably be doing it with a bit more cadence. So what happens when we try to tackle complex problems is we have to slow down more, we have to do more research, we have to ask more questions, we may have to pause and go out into the field and talk with the customers. And that sometimes scares groups. They're not ready to do that. They thought it would be simpler or easier. So making sure that expectations are set around complex projects requiring complex sets of actions and potentially more time is another pitfall, but sort of like misaligned expectations. And I guess related to all these is just patience. So much of, I collect feedback on all the framing sessions I do, all the workshops I do. And many of the, I wish this could have gone differently feedback is, I wish framing would have been faster. So everyone wants the problem to just be clear and understood. And unfortunately, it's an abstract space. So it requires slowing down, it requires discussion, probably requires stepping back. You might be a couple miles down the road and thinking about solutions, but since it's a team activity, you gotta make sure everyone's aligned. So you do have to be patient. You have to slow down a little bit, and slowing down in that sense and building that upfront alignment will let you speed up later. So developing patience, and you yourself as a facilitator needing to be patient is really important as well. Okay. This one from Shyam, this is an old question. And I wanted to address it. It's been sitting here and someone uploaded it, so that's great. Where does problem framing and design sprints fit in the agile process? So there's a framework called SAFE that came from some consultants, Scaled Agile Framework. I may be missing a letter in there or a word in there. And in that, they refer to things like prototyping or frameworks like design sprints as sprint zero. And in terms of like chronologically, that makes sense. It should happen before you. So framing, especially, is a very early conversation. It's done with a few people. You're trying to understand if this is even a space that you should get into. And once you do have that problem articulated, then that could be something that you would run a design sprint on, where you would start to articulate and prototype and test potential solutions to that problem. So I typically do framing up front, and then I do design sprints. With the trick to calling it sprint zero is that puts a lot of, there's a lot of then expectations that on this week we do framing, on this week we do design sprints, and on week 3 we bring the team of engineers and designers into the fray and we start building all of this stuff. But that's not how this process, that's not how innovation actually works. It's a lot of step forward, step back, step forward, step back. It's very iterative, it's circular. Sometimes you learn something or discover something in framing that requires you to go back and do additional research that then informs a new potential set of problems. Same with sprinting and solutions. You test a potential solution that has you challenge the problem that you're working on. So then you kind of go back, do additional research. It doesn't always go that sort of back and forth. But if you're just sort of like, in my experience, if you're using a Gantt chart to plan out your innovation process, it's probably going to be, you're probably going to be disappointed, because you're probably going to need to multitask. You're probably going to have to delay other projects when research or when things need to be delayed or paused or redone over again. So I would stress that you try not to catalog innovation in this sort of like rapid cadence of week by week by week. Certain things are happening. There is learning that's happening week in and week out, but sometimes the learning is to go back. So these are early activities. They do happen before agile development sprints. And what I'll do after today's workshop, I'll drop a link to an article I wrote way back when New Haircut was a product development studio. And we were trying to figure out the same question, because we used to do product agile development sprints, and we were trying to inform those sprints with better customer insights. So we learned about framing and design sprints and did them beforehand. So I'll share an article that shows sort of like the difference between when we talk about design sprints versus development sprints. Any follow-ups or anything, feel free to use the chat or come off mute. There's only a few of us here today, but I'm going to keep moving ahead. Okay, here's a good one. Ask an outside facilitator. Let me make a note to myself. I recorded a facilitator episode. I recorded a facilitator's Q&A episode on this question. Basically like pros and cons to being an internal versus an external facilitator. So on the pro side, it's great because you have that context. So me as an outsider, I don't have, of course, the experience, the business insider information that you have. And so you're able to better listen for cues when, say, for example, the team goes off track. or they're talking about a space that is not really meant to be in discussion for this sprint or for this workshop. So context clues are really, really important. That's why I spend so much time ahead of time interviewing people, understanding what's been done, trying to assess success versus things that we should avoid talking about, trying to like understand the barometer of what we should and should not be talking about. Things that they're excited about, things that they'd like to avoid. So that's where I put all that preliminary work into my workshops. I still don't have all the insider expertise that you have, but now at least I'm more informed. On the flip side, why is it less ideal when you're an internal facilitator? Number one, you're probably moonlighting as a facilitator, meaning you probably have a full-time job. You're a designer, a product leader, a UX researcher, or something like that. And what happens, in what I've heard, is you get tapped on the shoulder. Can you come and facilitate this thing for this group? Or your manager wants you to facilitate a workshop for your team, but you also have your job to perform. So not having that available time puts a crunch on you, and then we may start taking shortcuts and whatnot. So that's one. Another challenge is that you are part of the system, you're part of the team, so you may be subject to power and politics that me as an outside facilitator, or Peter as an outside facilitator, would not be subject to. Right? So we can kind of come in. That allows us a little bit more room to be honest, to be upfront, to say and spot things that we're noticing in terms of power dynamics or politics or other things that we're seeing that somebody else inside the team, it feels less comfortable airing and talking about, especially if your boss or your boss's boss is part of the sprint. You may also exert your own power or politics. So if I'm an SVP of product and I'm the facilitator, now I can sort of like extort my power a little bit during the session. So, and there's a temptation to do that. And then because of that, we may bring our own bias into these conversations. And I think probably the thing that skews, going back to potential problems or pitfalls, like I mentioned, bias is probably one of the things that will creep in, and it's it's subconscious. So things will enter into the conversation that knock our ideas off track or shush a really important idea that we may have wanted to spend a little bit more time unpacking. So those are some of the things that happen when you're part of the team and trying to facilitate a conversation. And like I always mention, a facilitator, so when I facilitate, I'm not part of the conversation itself, meaning I don't contribute ideas, I don't vote. When I do, when I have, maybe if it's a consumer product that I'm a customer of. I did a sprint with MailChimp, and I've been a customer of MailChimp's for 15 years or so. So I know the platform inside and out. It was very difficult for me to stay quiet, especially when they were talking about problems that entrepreneurs using MailChimp face. And I disagreed. So very difficult. So I had to ask them questions. I had to make sure that they still felt like they were talking about the right things. Very, very challenging. I can only imagine if I was a product manager working on the platform, how much more challenging it would be to keep quiet, to let other people surface questions and pose interesting ideas that I didn't necessarily agree with. So those are some of the tricky parts of being an internal facilitator. Like I mentioned, I recorded an episode where I talked a little bit more about this. It's a year or two old, so I'm curious to hear what I said back then. So I'll add a link to that as well. So those are these questions. Okay, and then I started to, we've got about 9 minutes left, so I'll probably get to these couple questions. And then we'll try to get in the next questions in the next AMA. There's a couple here. One by Gabe. He asked me to back up and sort of differentiate problem framing versus other discovery workshops. He's not here, so I can't ask him to give me an example of another discovery workshop. So I can only really speak for my version of problem framing, because even my version of problem framing, or New Haircut's version of problem framing, is different from yours, from the person down the street. Mine is based on challenges that I've had in working with client groups. So I use it to solve the challenges that my groups are trying to work through to make sure that they're finding and agreeing upon an important problem to solve. What I can say is that I've really benefited and appreciated the facilitation and design thinking principles that I learned by facilitating design sprints. And so I took those principles and structured this framework, this sort of set of activities and conversations to generate the same outcomes, the same sort of like moments for curiosity, moments for convergent and divergent thinking, showing, overtelling our ideas, visualizing the conversation. So some of the sort of core principles that design sprints do a great job of, I've incorporated in my problem framing activities and framework. So that's one. The other is, I think problem framing fits really, really nicely as a preliminary activity to do before design sprints. So what I mean by that, again, speaking about my problem framing workshop, is the series of activities and the conversations that happen paint a picture of exactly the questions and gaps in information that I used to not have before running design sprints. So to say that another way, when I would just jump into a design sprint, I had wished I had answers to this thing, research on this customer, clarity and buy-in on sort of maybe the customer personas and their existing experience. And so those are all the things that I address and bring into problem framing. And so because of that, there's a really nice fit between framing first and design sprints next. That's one advantage. If you're into design sprints, or if you're into any really prototyping process, I think there's a really nice relationship between framing and sprinting. And that sort of dovetails into what's probably going to be the last question for today. Is Matthew had asked if I ever sell, or I suppose run, framing as a standalone activity. And yes, for sure. Because sometimes a group is really just looking to evaluate a space that they may choose to move into. So maybe they're using framing as a way to set the vision. And Peter, you had asked a question I saw up top about the relationship between vision, using framing to set the vision versus really like unpacking the problem space. And so if a group, this happens where a group would say, hey, we're doing some annual planning, we're doing some quarterly planning, we're looking at this new space, or we saw that a competitor is over here and that's not really our sweet spot. So we'd like to evaluate if that's somewhere that we want to enter into this year or next year, something like this. You could use framing as a way to bring the team together to see that space together and decide what are the opportunities within there. Do they fit to the strategic priorities that our company is built upon and the things that we're interested in solving? And then if so, what would that experience look like? What are some challenges within the existing experience for our customers, for new customer segments? And that serves as a great jumping off point and sort of like, I think, Peter, how you described it, as a North Star. And then, having, what's really nice is when they're not piggybacked framing and design sprints, you have some time to sort of like unpack those, to breathe through them, to do some research, to go out into the field, to do some surveys, and to really make sure that it's a space that you understand and know well, so that when you are ready, you say, yes, this is great, we're ready to move forward. So when you are ready for that, you can start, you'll have your problem really well articulated and you can move into things like design sprints. So it's kind of like a yes and to this question up here, right? Like that space in between, as opposed to being like very regimented, week 1, 0, 2, 3, 4, if you do put some space in between, if you do have the luxury of slowing down, thinking about new opportunities, then you'll benefit, because then your sprints will be even more informed. Okay, let's see if I can just answer this one since we're down here. Do you come across clients that have, okay. Just put a note down here, make sure I know I answered this. So last question then. Framing is, this is a biased answer. Framing for me is relatively new. In my 22 years in technology, framing is the newest thing that I've spent time working through with groups for the last like 3 or 4 years. So it feels like a weaker muscle for me, for most of the groups that I work with. Also biased, it also feels like groups are starting to understand it. Asking better questions, coming to more and more of these AMAs. So like in terms of what I see, my like very limited view of the world is that there seems to be more interest and openness to problem framing. Some people refer to problem framing as discovery, and sometimes discovery, like innovation, can be a dirty word because it's unstructured, it's not actionable. Maybe you spend a lot of time and money on research that goes nowhere. Sometimes groups get together and talk about ideas and get really excited. And for whatever reason, those ideas get shelved. So discovery is this like big bloated category, which often hasn't meant much, but I do hear product people refer to problem framing as discovery, just maybe more well-intentioned, well-structured. Maybe it's design thinking powered discovery. And so because of that, and because product leaders, in my small opinion of how the world is thinking, product leaders tend to be more astute and thinking about understanding the importance of discovery and bringing the team together and establishing buy-in, and not just being like the leader, the product person that says, this is the direction we're going in, take it or leave it. So I think, just because of how things are going, I do think people are more interested, are more open to it. I can't speak for companies in France, but the companies that I've been working with, yeah, they do. And last point, I think still most of the starting conversations that when a company reaches out to work with me, 90% start with, we have this idea, we want you to come help us facilitate a design sprint, and I have to back them up into framing. So it's still sort of we're still on that path, it seems. But I'm excited to see the progress and more people interested and excited about framing. All right, that's it for today. Like I said, there's some resources down at the bottom here. If you'd like to see framing for yourself, there's a toolkit, which is completely self-serve. There's some additional resources. Please do get in touch with me if you'd like to ask additional questions. Of course, please come to the next AMAs, design sprints and facilitation. Those are coming up in the next couple of weeks. And if we didn't get to your questions around framing, the next one is Monday, February 21st. Thanks, everybody. Hope you're having a great week so far, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jay. That was a jam-packed 30 minutes. Really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. See you, gang.